Good morning, guys. We have period 5 today that we're going to be covering. We left off yesterday, period 4, with the multiple grassroots movements that American society began to see. When you start thinking about America at this time period, it's very reminiscent of other eras of massive change. And like the civil rights movement, for example, the 1950s and 60s, that was a grassroots movement. And one thing that you're going to notice is during those times, there are two peoples inside the United States of America that are going to fight together for equality. And that's women and African Americans. And so during the 1800s, the antebellum era, this reform movement, you see the fight for equality once again by African Americans and women. But don't forget, too, there's also other types of movements like the Great Awakening or a Second Great Awakening because of new peoples coming in. You have new religions forming, Mormonism, and many other areas like Oneida Farm. These places, again, are trying to find perfection and chasing that in human history, because you do have great change in the Industrial Revolution, too, that's starting to push people into more of a society that many, just don't appreciate. Brings on transcendentalist writing. These guys are trying to get back in touch with nature and to be one with it again. So this is a time of great change, but it's also a time that's the change is created by the people and their movements. So I really want to stress, women and African Americans working together in this fight for equality as they both grow. The women's rights movement, the push for, the voting rights and just equality in general. It's going to be seen over the century of the 1800s. And the same thing with abolitionism and equality for African Americans. I mean, the first thing they have to do is become a free people. And then after that, they're going to have to fight for equality and equal rights. It is both of these people that will really push together to gain equality in American society. So we're going to start there and we'll continue on. So let's begin with women. In the 1800s, you had the Seneca Fall Conference of 1848, which is going to lead to the Declaration of Sentiments and why women feel that they should be equal to men in society. And this is going to be the push for voting rights at the turn of the century. They'll come to fruition with the 19th Amendment of 1920. These are the things that women want and are going to use with African Americans, this argument of equality, why they should be equal, how the Constitution of the United States guarantees that, and namely, even before the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, which has long been argued. What does that mean? What is the interpretation and everything else? Well, this is going to be the debate throughout the 1800s. African Americans are going to fight with women in this because they have a common cause, equality. And this is just going to intensify change, because where you see the fight for changes, you're going to see the fight against change, right? This is the idea of liberalism versus conservatism. And this fight rages on to this day in America, or any society for that matter. And so African Americans in the push for abolition is going to be a natural course. They become a free people. Now they have a chance to become, equal in society, and that's ultimately what they want. So, African Americans in the expansion of the United States of America is also going to, bring up another question. What do these new states become as more and more people come to this country, and they are settling in these new areas across now the far reaches of the Midwest, past the Mississippi, going into the plains. Americans are going to ask, like, what are these states? Are they free states? Are they slave states? The Missouri Compromise of 1820 draws a line in the sand, so to speak. You had the Mason-Dixon line that is going to say anything south that is going to be added is going to be a slave state. Anything north that is going to be added is going to be a free state. And this is how this system worked up until it didn't. And then comes another compromise led by Henry Clay of 1850. And remember, these compromises are band-aids over gaping wounds. There's one thing that we never settled when we formed our own government, and that's the issue of slavery. It was so hotly debated, they simply dropped the issue. Matter of fact, they wrote slavery into the books with the Three-Fifths Compromise. This was to satisfy the South, knowing that they didn't have the population of the North, that the North sustained. They needed to add population to gain votes, to gain membership in the House, so they didn't feel that they were being overrun. And that starts the Three-Fifths Compromise, where 3/5 of the slave population would be counted as citizens or people, and adding votes again to the whites of the South who control them and hold them in bondage. This is the process of what our country becomes. It does write slavery into the Constitution. But that doesn't say that people are for this, or the majority of people are for this. What we do find out is by the turn of the century, with the increased abolitionist movement and books like, from the author Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin, this only intensifies this feeling that slavery has to end. And as it does, we're also expanding. And this is where all the tensions truly rise. So expansionism is like the forbidden fruit again. It is great for the economic purposes that America wants to serve. However, as far as social situations and the idea of society itself, the questions continue to come up. What about slavery? What about slavery? What about slavery? And this all culminates, obviously, 1850s, leading into Bleeding Kansas, leading into the American Civil War that will begin in 1861. So, this is the where America is. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry scares the South. It makes them believe that African Americans and whites together could abolitionist whites could band together to not only get rid of slavery, but murder whites that are in the South and their families that are slavers or slaveholders. And the South becomes very aware of this. They start forming militias. These militias that they formed in states will later become the Confederate Army. So you could see the buildup again leading into this war. It doesn't just happen out of thin air. It's 2 decades, not longer, a century, really, where you start to see this. So the American Civil War itself, the thing that I really want to focus on, guys, is not so much, the battles and generals and things like that. I want to really talk about really what the Civil War is going to ultimately decide in the end. The Civil War is going to be fought in the beginning to sustain the United States of America. Lincoln, his number one objective is to make sure that this union is preserved. And in doing so, he has to wage war on the South. They're trying to leave. And the South feels that it is their right constitutionally to do so. They did not feel that the Constitution was a binding contract. They looked at it as, well, if we want to leave, we can leave and we'll do our own thing. Obviously, this could have been catastrophic for the United States of America. And it wouldn't just hurt the North either. It hurt the South just as much. Remember, the ports, shipping, the infrastructure was mainly in the North. This was had an opportunity to destroy America and stop it from becoming what it was going to become, this economic giant that spread capitalism and democracy really throughout the world. But it was a war that in the end only decided one true thing. Well, a couple, I guess. The number one thing it's going to decide is that African Americans are going to be a free people. And this war will define that. It becomes the cause, actually, after Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation of 1862, and then 1863, his Gettysburg Address. It becomes the focal point of the war. It's no longer to preserve the Union. It's a fight for a new freedom for people. And that's what the Civil War is going to ultimately decide. And the other thing, and it'll still be debated from time to time, but it's pretty clear the federal government has power over the states and people. I mean, it forced them back into the Union, the South, the southern states and its people. So again, two main takeaways from that American Civil War. If you want to think about battles, I would focus on turning point within this Civil War, and that's Gettysburg. 3 days of battle that is going to really turn the war and shift the tides of this war towards the North. And it allows Abraham Lincoln to start thinking about reunification. It allows him to start pushing that idea. The Gettysburg Address preaches that we are going to have to come back together. He doesn't differentiate between North and South. He said that these men will not have died in vain, that we must come back together. Those are the types of things that Lincoln was already starting. This is 2 years before the end of the Civil War. Now, much more will happen. Sherman's march to the sea and the burning down of many southern cities, and basically breaking the will of the South until they succumb and are willing to rejoin the Union. But even then, Lincoln is not looking to punish the South. Lincoln welcomes the South back with open arms. He has the 10% clause, which 10% just had to vow allegiance to the United States of America in order to be readmitted into the United States. So this wasn't some great revolutionary change. I mean, many of these men still held racist thoughts, and many of them actually went back to owning land, the larger majority of them, and their career, and same career that they had in politics, senators and House members. But in the beginning, shortly after the Civil War, there are three phases, in a sense, of Reconstruction. Right after the Civil War, the first phase, the beginning of Reconstruction, to bring the nation back together, to institute new policies of equality for African Americans. What will these new free people look like? And that's even argued even about Lincoln's thoughts and what he truly felt in the end. And it's very hard to look at even his writings and the things that he would talk about in his speeches to try to determine whether or not he felt that the races should be equal. What we do know is this, is that push is going to happen. No one's going to deny that fact. The question that's going to come up is, now what? And African Americans are going to be the ones who push this question the most. What now? What do we do? Where do we go? What does this look like for us? Where's our opportunity in this country? And that fight is going to be waged, and that's Reconstruction. The bringing back together of this nation physically, but also as far as society goes. So the first stage of that Reconstruction, short-lived, is presidential. It's the time that Abraham Lincoln was president during the first phase of Reconstruction, and it's months. Unfortunately, Lincoln is going to be assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. Before he is assassinated, though, he does pass the 13th Amendment, which is going to ban slavery. And so this is the start, right? And a lot of people are like, wait, what? Ban slavery? What about the Civil War? Didn't that end it? No, it didn't. Remember the Emancipation Proclamation. What it did is it freed slaves of the rebellion states in the South. There were 5 states that were still in the North that held on to their slaves, that had slavery on the law books. But after the war, that will go away, and it goes away with the 13th Amendment. Now, you can also argue that obviously this had to be the course of action. It was not easily done, though. You have to realize that these states are coming back in. And again, these people are coming back in with harboring the same racist beliefs and thoughts that they once had. And they know the process. If slavery goes away, the next question is equality. And this goes against what they believe in society, what they believe it to be. So this is where it's all going to rage. And guys, this goes back all the way to guys like John C. Calhoun of the South, who said that this was the greater good, that slavery would not only assist African Americans, but it's going to assist the South and its masters, and ultimately the United States of America and what it produces. And this is just this great institution, benign institution that is going to be what's best for African Americans, because their thought process was, if African Americans were going to be free, then how could they compete with whites who were superior to them. That was what they were preaching. This is the thought process, and this is why this fight is going to be so difficult to even just gain freedom after the Civil War and the 13th Amendment. But they are able to pass this piece of legislation. And his assassination brings on the next stage, which is the radical stage of Reconstruction. Radical Republicans, guys like Charles Sumner in the Senate and Thaddeus Stevens of the House, are able to pass two major pieces of legislation and amendments to the Constitution. The 14th Amendment, which is going to be the Civil Rights Amendment, that is going to try to guarantee equality amongst the races of people. And then the 15th Amendment, which is going to be the Voting Rights Amendment, that is going to say that you cannot be denied the right to vote because of the color of your skin or your race. This is where we start to see this fight shaping up. And the South begins to fight these changes. They look at this as too radical, as something that goes against everything in their society. They institute policies, economic and social ones, that are going to return African Americans to subservient roles to that of whites. These are things like Jim Crow, segregation, right, which were known as black codes, which were aimed to keep blacks in society in their place. You had segregationist policies in schools and bathrooms and restaurants. African Americans would have to go to the back door to receive a meal at a restaurant. They couldn't sit in the restaurant. They couldn't order their food from a table. These are the types of things that were instituted, but it goes far reaching, much more than that. You had schools where, maybe there was a few, black schools in the area. They were starved of funding. They got all the hand-me-downs from white schools and the white students, 30-year-old, 20-year-old textbooks, and, you name it. That list goes on. And this will last all the way through the 1950s into the 1960s. It is not going to be defined until the Civil Rights Amendment in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That's 100 years after the Civil War. This is pretty astounding when you think about it. This fight is just going to continue. But the economic side of things during Reconstruction, the fight back, the pushback against these radical amendments, in the sense that what they felt were changes, the South instituted also sharecropping, which basically put blacks into a role of slavery, just without chains and bondage. It still made them sign contracts that said if they broke this contract, they could be arrested or dealt with in the way that the landowner wanted. I mean, this was no different. And the landowners would take the majority of their crop that year, and they couldn't say anything about it. They couldn't stop it. This is where the fight is going to rage between the North and the South. The war has not ended. It has almost just begun. It's going to wage for the next 100 years, and tensions will come and go. But what we see is that the third phase of Reconstruction is known as the redemption phase. And this is where the South basically reclaims the South. And how does it do it? Well, I talked about sharecropping and Jim Crow black codes, but there's also something else too. There's something that the South is going to do to African Americans that is really going to start to put them in a state of fear. And they're rightfully so. The KKK is the largest terrorist organization in America, and they will begin to terrorize the South. They will begin to terrorize the people of the South, African Americans or whites that are in support of African American policies of equality. And guys, the KKK starts to spread even to northern rural areas. And this is, I guess, what we even see today, this division in a sense. And the question comes up, why? Why do we see the spread of hate organizations to these areas? And the answer is probably pretty simple. In cities, you have the acceptance of change because there's multiple different peoples and groups, and things just happen so quickly, and you're so inundated with different peoples and interacting with them that there's, in a sense, no fear. But In these rural areas, there isn't that. You have homogenous societies where there's not a lot of difference. And that lack of difference usually drives this idea of fear. Well, what if this did change? What if these people came into this area? How would that look? How would that change things? And this is going to start all kinds of racism spreading even to the north. And we'll see that. And we'll definitely see that when the Great Migration begins to happen in our northern cities with race riots of 1919. But what I want you guys to understand is that this redemption phase is where Reconstruction will fail. It is where the KKK, Jim Crow, Black Code, sharecropping all basically reclaim the South and return it to what it once was. So what did African Americans gain in a sense then? Well, there were some advantages or things that they did gain. Obviously, black schools were opened in the South. This was a victory. The Freedmen's Bureau helped in doing this, right? But what it failed to do, the Freedmen's Bureau, is to redistribute land and get African Americans the opportunity. I mean, this is an agrarian society. So if you're truly going to have a chance, you have to own land. So then you can pass that land down to your kids, right? And then their kids and so on and so on. And this is how you build up something. It's home ownership basically too. It's the same way in American society. If you don't own a home, you can't pass that wealth down to your children. And this is where African Americans are denied that. They're forced to rent in the South. And when they move to northern cities in the Great Migration, once again, they'll be forced to rent in cities because of redlining and denied the right to own homes. So for this process, it really shows what we're going to become. And that is the importance of the American Civil War, Reconstruction, and the failure of. It truly predicts. It tells us why we are going to become this. It is truly what's past is prologue here. We know why we become of the 1950s and 60s because of what was done during the Civil War and shortly after and even before. So this period is mightily important to our history. And it's one that you truly have to understand. In 1877, it is going to be the end of Reconstruction. The failure of Reconstruction is Rutherford B. Hayes, a Republican, and James Tilden, a Democrat, are running for president. And Tilden and Hayes are locked in this battle where neither one, again, has the electoral votes. And the South is pushing for Tilden to be elected. And, the idea of Tilden or blood, that the revolution could happen all over again, there's a compromise that's made. And guys, you have to realize even before this, the Panic of 1873, an economic panic, a recession that is going to, really cut into the American wallet and ultimately the American psyche, really focuses their attention there. And a lot of people start leaving the movement of Reconstruction and the idea of equality for African Americans behind and really focusing on the economy. And so the movement begins to die out in 1872, the rise of the KKK, redemption, and by 1873, the panic. The North begins to give up on Reconstruction. And eventually that 1877 compromise is that the North pulls out of the South, leaves the South to return to its own, without interference, Black soldiers to federal soldiers being down in the South, enforcing policies to assist African Americans. They give up on that idea and they allow the South to return to what it once was. And this becomes the new South. But it looks a heck of a lot like the old South in the idea that white supremacy will reign again. And it will reign for the next close to 100 years. And that is the importance, in a sense, of this time period. It shows us what we will become and the fight that's truly ahead.